So, if you have ever wondered whether eggs are helping you or quietly working against you, you're not alone. Eggs may be the most debated food in modern nutrition. And for adults over 60, the advice can feel inconsistent and sometimes even contradictory. So, in this video, we're not here to defend eggs and we're not here to ban them. We're going to look at the evidence calmly, carefully, and in context. Because the real question isn't are eggs good or bad? It is this: for which person? At what dose? Inside what overall diet? And with which lab response? And by the end, you'll have a simple way to decide whether eggs fit for you. And before we go any further, let me briefly introduce myself. I'm George. I'm a biological scientist by education and training. And I've spent much of my life working in evidence-based fields where data matter. I'm also over 60, and I'm navigating my own health journey, including life on a GLP-1 medication. So this channel isn't about theory. It's about applying good science to real bodies in real time. And today we're going to do that with eggs. We'll answer 3 basic questions. First, what does epidemiology actually show about egg intake and long-term health? Second, what do randomized trials tell us when eggs are tested under controlled conditions? And third, how do we apply the evidence to someone over 60, especially if you're monitoring lipids or navigating a GLP-1 medication? Because evidence only matters if it can be applied. And that's where we're headed today. So now, admittedly, this is where much of the confusion begins. It feels intuitive to assume that eating cholesterol in eggs automatically raises blood cholesterol. But human physiology is much more regulated than that. The liver acts as a regulator. And when dietary cholesterol rises, the liver often reduces its own production. And for most people, that feedback system works quite well. Some individuals, though, are strong responders. Their LDL may rise more noticeably. And genetics, baseline LDL, metabolic health, and overall diet all influence that response. And what often shifts isn't just total cholesterol, but lipoprotein behavior, particle number, particle size, and context. This isn't about denying biology. It's about understanding how regulated that biology really is. So this is where randomized trials become helpful. Instead of observing patterns, we can test what actually happens when eggs are added under controlled conditions. And across trials, a fairly consistent pattern appears. LDL may rise modestly in some individuals, but the average change is usually small. And at the same time, HDL often rises. For example, a randomized trial published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition by Blesso and colleagues found that whole eggs raised HDL and improved markers of cholesterol transport, even when LDL shifted slightly. And when we look beyond a single LDL value and examine lipid ratios and related markers, the overall effect is typically neutral. Most of these studies are short-term and measured surrogate markers, not clinical events. But taken together, randomized trials do not show a consistent signal that moderate egg intake drives cardiovascular risk upward. Now let's zoom out. Individual studies vary, and that's normal science. Meta-analyses, on the other hand, allow us to examine the total body of evidence. And when researchers analyze egg consumption across large populations, the overall signal is relatively stable. At moderate intake levels, there is no consistent evidence that eggs increase cardiovascular risk in the general population. And large meta-analyses, published in BMJ, found no meaningful association between typical egg consumption and heart disease or stroke. And some subgroup analyses, particularly in diabetes, suggest possible variation at higher intakes, but findings are not uniform. And observational data cannot establish causation. So for most people, eggs do not appear to function as independent risk drivers. And this is important. dietary pattern matters more than a single food, which means the bigger picture is still what actually protects you. So before we look at population studies, it helps to clarify what epidemiology actually does, because much of the concern around eggs comes from observational data. Epidemiology, for those of you who might not be familiar with the term, examines large populations over long periods of time. It identifies patterns where outcomes cluster and what exposures tend to track together. And that makes it useful for detecting signals, but it cannot establish causation, especially when foods are consumed together. In Western dietary patterns, eggs rarely appear alone. They're often eaten with processed meats, refined carbohydrates, and higher overall dietary risk. When broader patterns carry risk, it becomes difficult to isolate the independent effect of a single food. In that context, egg intake may function as a dietary marker rather than a causal agent. So epidemiology is informative, but not decisive. It is one lens among several. Okay, so let's bring this home to older adults, and especially to those of us using GLP-1 medications. Eggs are a source of high-quality protein. They provide all essential amino acids, including leucine, which supports muscle maintenance as we age. They're easy to prepare, easy to portion, easy to chew, and for many people, they promote satiety without requiring a large meal. And that can be helpful when appetite is reduced or when meals need to be simple but still nourishing. And some pasture-raised or range-fed eggs like this one may contain slightly higher omega-3 levels and more fat-soluble antioxidants. And those differences are real, but they're not dramatic. And at the same time, older adults are not identical. Some individuals show larger LDL responses. Some are managing diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or elevated ApoB. So the goal here isn't rigid rules. It's thoughtful attention, which means that you should monitor your labs, monitor your metabolic health, and consider the whole dietary pattern. Let eggs be one option among many, not an obligation, and certainly not a fear. And this is a good moment to step back and explain why this pattern resonates with me. And part of it is personal. I was born and raised in Greece. I grew up around simple food, real food, shared in community, and repeated day after day. But this isn't about nostalgia. The more I've studied nutrition, the more clearly a consistent pattern emerges. And when researchers examine Mediterranean diets and long-lived populations, they don't find extremes, they find stability. Vegetables, legumes, olive oil, whole grains, modest portions of animal foods. Eggs appear, but they're not central. And they're usually eaten a few times per week within meals anchored by plants, like an omelette with feta cheese, tomatoes, onions, spices, spinach, and herbs. In other words, eggs support the pattern, they don't define it. And long-lived populations aren't chasing superfoods. They're repeating simple, nourishing habits over decades. And that convergence, personal experience, and consistent research is hard to ignore. And I'm not asking you to anchor or adopt a label, just to consider whether this kind of steady pattern might quietly support your health. And as I often say on this channel, real food can be medicine for the body, and in its own quiet way, for the soul also. And this is a good moment to pause and pull all these threads together. So, what did we learn? First, eggs are not poison. When we look at randomized trials, meta-analyses, and long-term population data, there is no consistent evidence that moderate egg consumption is harmful to most older adults. Second, eggs are not a loophole. They don't cancel out a weak dietary pattern. They don't override physiology, and they don't replace the need for awareness and periodic monitoring. And third, and this may be the most important point, patterns matter more than individual ingredients. Eggs behave differently depending on the context in which they appear. When they're part of a pattern built on whole foods, plants, fiber, olive oil, and steady habits over time, they tend to integrate well. And when they're isolated, when they're overemphasized or used to compensate for a weaker pattern, that's when confusion and controversy often follow. So the story here was never really about eggs. It was about how we think about food, how we hold evidence, how we apply it with patience and discernment in real life. And before I go, I just want to say thank you. And if you stayed with me to this point, I appreciate it. And if this was helpful, consider liking the video and subscribing. It generally helps those conversations reach other adults who are trying to think clearly about their health. And if you're navigating life on a GLP-1 medication, let me encourage you. This is not about perfection. It's about awareness. It's about learning how your body responds, monitoring wisely, and choosing patterns that support you over years, not just days. And my friend, you're allowed to enjoy food. You're allowed to be thoughtful. And you do not need to live in fear of individual ingredients. You live in a time of extraordinary abundance. Good food is available just about everywhere. Nourishing food is available, and you can approach it with gratitude and not anxiety. You're not behind. You're not broken. You're not doing this wrong, just because maybe progress takes time. Remember, real food can be medicine for the body, and in its own quiet way for the soul as well. So remember, stay curious, my friends. Be patient with your body and be at peace. This is George with GLP-1s for Seniors. And God willing, I will see you next time.